Hi, we are Peter and Linda Warren. We're coming to you live from YWAM Denver.
Yes, we are. It's wonderful to be with you again.
Good to chat with some of you that have connected with us over the last few weeks as a ministry that's going through the same thing most of you are. We're all sort of quarantined. Quite a few of our staff are still in Denver. And so we thought it would be great to start these Facebook Live events, which has given a number of us a chance to express our hearts during this time that's been so unusual. A lot of us have been going through the extremes of the joy of having some free time. For us, there's been parts of that, but also the anxiety, the uncertainty, things that have really had us digging deep in terms of our faith and understanding what God's doing in our world today.
Yes. Hey, Rob and Leonhardt, you're watching from Australia. Good to see you. Well, we can't see you, but love you very much.
Yes. So, we've been reflecting a lot on the work we do in Youth with a Mission, and primarily the opportunity we have to see young people come in, just like we were at one time.
Yes.
Inexperienced.
We're still young in heart.
Yeah. Inexperienced. Having a heart and a passion for God, but realizing that sometimes the folks we get are in a process of discovery, of figuring out what God has for them in the world. And we use terms like calling and destiny and passion. And, sometimes the whole process of figuring out what am I called to do, it's such a big question. And figuring out as well the giftings we have, what am I good at? And realizing sometimes we have things that God has placed in our hearts, and we have a capacity far beyond what we know ourselves until we get involved in the whole practice of ministry and walking it out.
Yes. And Bon Sarabia from the Philippines. That's awesome. You're tuning in again. Love you, bro. Yeah, I think one of the most amazing things for me is, and I wrote a song about this years ago, is that God has woven me before anyone else knew me. He formed me in my mother's womb. Psalm 139:13. He predestined me to do certain things for him, and nobody else can do it exactly like I can do it, because that unique design that I have from God's imagination and his dream that he formed me to do something specific is an amazing thing.
Mm-hmm. And I think that as we first started out in ministry, what we've discovered is there's such a great joy when we take a chance and a risk and we sort of step out into the unknown and discover, hopefully most of the time, it's exciting. It's beyond what we expected, but we're able to actually, when we're pushed into a realm of new ministry giftings and we sort of put our toes in the water, then suddenly it's exciting and we enjoy it. And I think for us, that's one of the things that's most fulfilling about working with YWAM is we see that over and over again. We see people that have never done public speaking, never been on an outreach, never gone cross-culturally, sometimes never even left their home state and gone across state borders. Suddenly come into the mix of internationals and be asked to share their testimony or eventually lead a team and go into a culture where they can't speak the language, but they discover they can really share the heart of God, sometimes even more meaningfully when you can't speak the language because you have to dig deeper, right?
Yes, and that was my experience.
Yeah.
As a young 19-year-old coming into Youth with a Mission, I'd had guitar lessons as a kid, and so I knew how to play the guitar and sing, but I never really thought much about public speaking. I'd done some of it, but it kind of was a little nerve-wracking, and part of it was that there were some things that happened that created an insecurity in me in front of people. And when God healed that, then it opened up a whole realm for me to be able to embrace the things that he created me to do.
At the same time, though, I have felt times when I had to meet a need and I was willing to volunteer in an area, but I found I was really uncomfortable. And maybe that wasn't really for me. And I think that the learning process of that is that I do have certain things that God has gifted me with, and maybe I can temporarily work outside those giftings for a short time, but realizing that maybe doing it for too long a time can create anxiety. So what is there a scriptural piece or something that God really tells us about how he's created us?
No, and that's absolutely true, because through experience, we're able to define the limits of what we're good at, really, what our giftings are. And so in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, starting at verse 12, and if you've been at YWAM Denver before, you may have heard me share about this, where Paul is talking about the limits of his authority or of his gifts. Because the key is to find the things that God created us to do, and then to be involved in those things. And so in verse 12, he basically brings out one of the major areas where people miss their calling or their assignment from God. And it says, "For we dare not class ourselves with those who compare themselves and commend themselves." So comparison is one of the things that really hurts us from being able to fully embrace what God has called us to do. Because if you compare yourself, there's only two options, right? You either feel inferior or superior, and neither of them are good. And he goes on to say, you're not wise if you do that. And then verse 13, 2 Corinthians 10:13, "We, however, will not boast beyond our measure." So he uses that word for measure. I think of a little lady in a third world country buying a kilo of beans, and that's a measure they pour into her bag. But within the limits of the sphere which God appointed us, a sphere which especially includes you. And he goes on to say, because we're not overextending ourselves. And some people overextend themselves to try and do other things. And you know what, like you said, it's part of the learning process where you're able to go, you know what, I know God hasn't called me to do that. You don't compare yourself. You begin walking in those things, and through experience and over time, you're able to define this is the thing God created me to do.
Yeah, I think, too, we often talk about things that we have burdens for. And so many times I've talked to people new in their journey of ministry, trying to figure out, well, where does God want me and what am I called to do? Which essentially at the core of it has to do with the way he's made us, because we are his workmanship, and he's crafted us and created within us a piece of something that we bring to the table, that we bring to mankind, and we're uniquely made to do that. Yeah. But I think that as we walk through life and we're trying to early on discover that maybe sometimes we take on a passion or a burden or a heart for something. I think it's the way we usually express it.
Passion.
And then maybe it doesn't work out, or we don't really know if God's the confusion of whether God's calling us to that.
Yes. Hey, I see some friends there. I mean, some are close to us here, but Sarah Tracy used to be here. Dave Gustafson, hey, from Castle Rock, Colorado. Dave G is a dear old friend. I think he still holds the record for leading more DTSs than any other person in history. So, what you're saying, Linda, is really important. And that is, there's a difference between a burden and a calling. What's the difference between a burden and a calling? Well, when we came out to Denver, prior to that, we'd been in Los Angeles at the U.S. Center for World Missions, and the whole focus was on unreached people groups. And so we thought, when the Lord began to speak to us to leave LA, that we were going to go overseas to an unreached people group. And then the Lord began to speak to us about Denver, and it's like, there are no unreached people in Denver that we know of. But when we came out here, the Lord showed us there's a difference between a burden and a calling. Just because you have a passion or a burden for something doesn't necessarily mean God has called you to do that. Because what he spoke to us was that our burden was to go, but he was calling us to stay and make it easier for others to go. So,
thereby fulfilling,
yes,
indirectly, but still contributing to what the end in mind was that we had a heart for.
yes,
And I think there are different ways that we can take on a burden that isn't necessarily God's calling on our lives.
yeah,
God at one time really sort of spoke to me about the fact that when he creates an individual, a brand new little baby with this perfect little personality that he has
you're experiencing that recently,
yeah,
right?
we just had another grandchild a couple days ago. So, but you know, that's before any of us have made any mistakes, or been the victims of things happening to, or seen other people victimized by things. The ways that we sometimes build and catch a burden or a heart for something, sometimes isn't necessarily what God created us to do.
Yeah.
It's just a part of being human and loving and caring for people. And I think that is where we have to really go back to our basics in hearing God's voice, which is what we had to do in the experience Peter just shared, is that we knew he directed us to go somewhere, even though we didn't know why we were going, but we had to trust him that with the heart we had for the mission field and for other nations, he would find a way for us to express that love for the nations, but that we needed to be obedient and go to a city in the middle of America, literally Denver's in the middle, and as far as you can get from the nations, really, you have to get on an airplane, and you know, trust him that he was going to find a way to lay that heart and that passion at his feet and to trust him in that. And I think that's one of the hardest things when you have a burden for something. Confusion can come because we try to make a way to address it ourselves without really knowing God has given us that word, and it's out of obedience to him.
Yeah. Hey, Bishop Ajala, dear friend, Bishop Israel Ade Ajala from Nigeria. We've known him and his wife Adiola for 30 years, I think, maybe
Yes.
approximately. And they came to Denver, and he is now bishop in this whole denomination. And thanks for tuning in. Love you very much. I think just to kind of underscore what you're saying,
Yes.
Linda, think of it this way. David had a burden to build the temple, but God called him to step back, and Solomon built the temple. Mm-hmm. And Jesus clearly loves the whole world, and when he was on earth, he loved the whole world. John 3:16 tells us, and yet he knew that his calling from God, his assignment, I think that word is maybe better than calling, that sometimes is confusing, but his assignment was to the lost tribe of the house of Israel. And he resisted doing ministry. It wasn't because he didn't love others or have a passion or a burden for the whole world. And so we have to make that distinction. And the way to do it is, like you said, we've got to lay our burdens down. Mm-hmm. Sometimes burdens come from just things that have happened. I remember we were talking to a young man who said, I want to go back to somewhere, Ohio or somewhere in the Midwest, and reach all my friends with the gospel. And now that I've found Jesus, because I used to be a drug addict and I want to reach them. And I remember you said to him, the fact that you got involved in drugs didn't change God's calling on your life before you were born.
Yeah.
What is that thing he's called you to do?
Yeah. And also God's hopes and dreams for us. I think we have to be really careful. In this day and age, I don't want to just pin this on young people, because I think we all have become accustomed to having instantaneous gratification. We have our phones, we can Google anything. If you have a conversation, you're always 5 times looking at Google to see if our facts are right? And
well, if you're teaching, you have to be careful, because everyone can fact check you.
Yeah. But a walk with God is a process, and it's a slow process, because it's acts of faithfulness. And I think that it's his delight to sort of uncover and unpeel, so to speak, the gifts he's put within us, the different hopes and dreams that he has for us that are beyond what we have for ourselves.
Yeah.
I mean, when we're young, we have a lot of dreams and hopes, but God has far more for you than you have for yourself. And sometimes it just takes that process of walking in obedience. And for us, that's truly been in our whole missions career, so to speak. So many times when we have thought we wanted to do one thing, it looked desirable, it was a part of what we hoped and dreamt, but God said no. One thing I think of is that Peter grew up in Argentina, and so he speaks Spanish fluently. And early in our marriage, we thought, well, obviously, he has a passion for the Spanish-speaking culture. He speaks fluently, so that should equal we're going to be called to South America. And we had discussions about it. But as logical as that was for us, when we asked the Lord, he said, no, I've called you to Denver. And of course, in that, he began to unveil what he had for us in the future. But going back to those basics. And in this time of quarantine and things being uncertain, I think that what we're hearing when we connect with all of our YWAM friends around the world, we're all, as a body of Christ, hearing the same thing. It's a time to go back to basics.
Yes.
To go back to understanding when we don't know what to do, we have the security that we have a God that speaks to us, that he's living, that he has compassion on us. He knows how he created us. He knows our hopes and dreams, and he has even greater hopes and dreams for us than we do. So kind of, for me, there's been a lesson in what my burden has been in relation to the activities we were involved in before all this happened that came to a halt. I've had to lay those things down and say, hey, maybe those aren't ministries I can be involved in right now.
Yes.
But God in his faithfulness knows that I still have the same essential capacity to reach the world.
Yes, and you can still do it. Right. So
Right.
for us in YWAM, we feel called to the lost and the least and the last and the lonely. So people that are lost in their identity, but also because they don't know Christ. And the least, not just children, but anyone who's disadvantaged or has less than us. We are called to the least. And we are called to the last, to those who haven't heard the good news that forgiveness is available, that the gospel, that Jesus is real. And then to the lonely. There are a lot of lonely people. And that's our calling. But really what has happened in the last 3 months has limited our ability to do that effectively. And so what do? Do we step back? No, we just have to pivot. We have to find a way to fulfill our calling because that hasn't changed. You just have to find a different way to fulfill that. So we are reaching out to the poor and needy in our city. We know that many pastors and churches are doing that, but we are doing that as well because that's a way to fulfill our calling to the lost and the last and the least and the lonely.
Yeah, even though it looks a little different. I know one of our staff members that has been involved in leading discipleship training schools and really enjoys seeing that one-on-one response as people grow. At the beginning of this, he said he was all alone in a room, basically living kind of by himself for the last few months, but he said God spoke to him, to call one person a day. And what that does is it's his exercising his gifting to encourage and pastor people just over the phone. A simple thing, call one person a day. And I was so encouraged by that because I saw out of his obedience, he was able to really continue that ministry gifting within him to pastor others.
Yeah. Hey, so before Linda closes this, I'm wondering, those who are online, does anyone have a question or something that you feel like, well, what about this? I mean, I kind of see what you're saying, but it doesn't fit with this. Or maybe you want to, something doesn't fully make sense. Does anyone have a question you'd like to ask? We'd be happy to answer, and Linda would be happy to answer it. And we'd be happy to answer it. So, we'll just kind of wait a little bit. Thank you there. Elba, wow, from Peru. How awesome. In Spanish, saludo y bendiciones de Peru. Jonathan's amazing man of God on our staff. He was a pastor in the Midwest. Isaac, thanks for tuning in. If anyone has any questions, please let us know. Dave G, you're still watching. I've never known you to be short of words. Well.
Great. Well, we love and appreciate all of you, our YWAM family, and as well as all of our friends and family around the world. And we appreciate your prayers during this time. We are 2 weeks out from bringing our whole team back full-time June 1st. We're just trusting with a little bit of opening of Colorado that we're going to be able to engage more actively with the city and with ministry. But we appreciate your prayers, and I hope that you're really encouraged in whatever those giftings are that God's given you, that basic calling on your life or capacity to reach the world, that none of these circumstances can drown that out. That essentially you just need to shift a little bit or pivot a little bit and find a way to still express his heart to the world.
Yes. So,
bless you
thanks
guys.
for watching. Do you want to tell them about the anything else related to
this week? Every
the coming
night
week?
we have worship. Rachel and Andrew will be doing worship again on Wednesday night. Bear with us if you've been watching for the last few weeks. You know we've been playing around with sound in different places as people are quarantined in different locations, but we have a great week lined up every night at 7 o'clock.
Yes. Bless you guys. Love you.
Bye.
Have a good night.